Hello, students. Welcome to today's lecture. We'll be discussing Sylvia Plath's biography today. And obviously, in previous lecture, we have touched slightly about her life and initial writing phase. So we have already read that she was born on October 27, 1932, and Plath finally died on 11th February 1963. She was an American poet, novelist, and writer of short stories. Her most notable achievements came in the genre of confessional poetry, which often reflected her intense emotions and her battle with depression. Although her career and life uh, were complicated, she won a posthumous Pulitzer Prize and remains a popular and widely studied poet. There are some facts which I have written here for you all. So, if you go into the detail of Plath's life and her early childhood, then we find that uh, Plath was born in Boston and she was the first child of Otto and Aurelia Plath. Otto was a German born entomologist and the author of book about bumblebees and a professor of biology at Boston University, while Aurelia was a second generation American whose grandparents had emigrated from Austria. So, 3 years later, their son Varen was born, and the family moved to Winthrop in 1936. So, while living there, Plath published her first poem at the age 8 in Boston's Herald. It was a children's section. She continued writing and publishing in several local magazines and papers. And she won prizes for her writing and artwork. And when she was 8, her father died from complications after a foot amputation related to long untreated diabetes. Aurelia Plath then moved the entire family, including her parents, to the nearby Wellesley, where Plath attended high school. Around the same time as her high school graduation, she had her first nationally published piece, which appeared in the Christian Science Monitor. Her education and marriage, we can say, after graduating high school, Plath began her studies at Smith College in 1950. She was an excellent student and achieved the position of editor at the college's publication. The Smith Review, which led to the stint as guest editor of Mademoiselle magazine in New York City. Her experiences that summer included a missed meeting with Dylan Thomas, a poet she admired, as well as a rejection from Harvard's writing seminar and her initial experiment with self-harm. By this point, Plath had been diagnosed with clinical depression and she was undergoing electroconvulsive therapy in an attempt to treat it. So, in August 1953, she made first documented suicide attempt. She survived and spent the next 6 months receiving intensive psychiatric care. Olive Higgins Proti, and author who had successfully rebounded from a mental breakdown, paid for her hospital stay and her scholarship, and eventually Plath was able to recover, graduate from Smith with highest honors, and win a Fulbright scholarship to Newnham College, one of the all-female college at Cambridge. In 1955, upon graduating from Smith, she won the Glascock Prize for her poem Two Lovers and a Beachcomber by the Real Sea. In February 1956, Plath met Ted Hughes, a fellow poet whose work she admired, while they were both at the University of Cambridge. After a whirlwind courtship, during which they frequently wrote poems to each other, they married in London in June 1956. They spent the summer on their honeymoon in France and Spain, then returned to Cambridge in the fall of Plath's second year of studies, during which they both became intensely interested in astrology and related supernatural concepts. Now, in 1957, after her marriage to Hughes, Plath and her husband moved back to the United States, and Plath began teaching at Smith. Her teaching duties, however, left her with little time to actually write, which frustrated her. As a result, they moved to Boston, where Plath took a job as a receptionist at General Hospital's psychiatric ward, and in the evenings attended writing seminars hosted by the poet Robert Lowell. It was there that she first began to develop that would become her signature writing style. Lowell, along with fellow poet Annie Sexton, encouraged Plath. Sexton wrote in a highly personal confessional poetry style and in a distinctly female voice. In her influence helped Plath to do the same. Plath began to more openly discuss her depression and even her suicide attempts, particularly with Lowell and Sexton. She began working on more serious projects and began considering her writing more professionally and seriously around this time. In 1959, Plath and Hughes embarked a trip across the United States and Canada. During their travels, they spent some time at the Yaddo Artist Colony in Saratoga Springs, that is in New York. So while at the colony, which served as a retreat for writers and artists to nurture creative pursuits without interruptions from the outside world, and while among other creative people, Plath began to slowly feel more comfortable about the weirder and darker ideas she was drawn to. Even so, she had yet to completely broach the deeply personal, private material that she had been encouraged to draw upon. At the end of 1959, Plath and Hughes returned to England, where they had met and settled in London. Plath was pregnant at the time, and their daughter Frida Plath was born in April 1960. Early in her career, Plath achieved some measures of publishing success. She had been shortlisted on several occasions by the Yale Younger Poets Book Competition. Her work had been published in Harper's Magazine, The Spectator, and the Times Literary Supplement, and she had a contract with The New Yorker. In 1960, her first full collection, The Colossus and the Other Poems, was published. The Colossus was first released in UK, where it was met with significant praise. Plath's voice in particular was praised, as well as her technical mastery of imagery and wordplay. So, all of the poems in the collection had previously been published individually. In 1962, the collection received a US publication where it was received a little less enthusiastically, with criticism of her work being too derivative. So, the Belzer, which was written in between 1962 to 63, is considered the most famous of Plath's work. Her novel, The Belzer, was semi-autobiographical in nature, but it included enough information about her own life that her mother attempted unsuccessfully to block its publication. So, in essence, the novel compiled incidents from her own life and added fictional elements to it in order to explore her mental and emotional state. The Belzer tells the story of Esther, a young woman who gets a chance to work at a magazine in New York City but struggles with the mental illness. As we said, it is autobiographical, so that is why even the main character of the novel is story is struggling with mental illness. It's clearly based on many of Plath's own experiences, and it addresses two of the themes that mattered most to Plath, that was mental health and female empowerment. Issues of mental illness and treatment are everywhere in the novel, shedding some light on the way it was treated and how Plath herself might have been treated. So, the novel also handles the idea of the female search for identity and independence, especially emphasizing Plath's interest in the plight of women in the workforce during the 1950s and 60s. Her experiences in the publishing industry exposed her to many bright, hardworking women who were perfectly capable of being writers and editors but were only permitted to do secretarial work. So the novel was finished during a particular tumultuous period in Plath's life. In 1961, she became pregnant again and suffered a miscarriage. She wrote several poems about the devastating experience she had. When they began renting to a couple, David and Asia Wavell, Hughes fell in love with Asia and they began an affair. Plath and Hughes' son Nicholas was born in 1962. And later that year, when Plath learned about her husband's affair, the couple separated. So, Plath's true work Ariel was published posthumously in 1965. So, it marked her most personal and devastating work yet, fully embracing the genre of confessional poetry. Lowell, her friend and mentor, was a significant influence on Plath, particularly his collection Life Studies. The poem in the collection contains some dark, semi autobiographical elements drawn from her own life and her experiences with depression and suicide. In the decades after her death, a few more publications of Plath's work were released. Two more volumes of poetry, Winter Trees and Crossing the Water, were released in 1971. These volumes included previously published poems as well as 9 never before seen poems from earlier drafts of Ariel. 10 years later, in 1981, the collected poems was published, featuring an introduction by Hughes and an array of poetry spanning from her early efforts in 1956 until her death in 1963. Plath was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. After her death, some of Plath's letters and journals were published. Her mother edited and selected some letters, published in 1975 as Letters Home, Correspondence 1950 to 1963. And in 1982, some of her adult diaries were published as The Journals of Silvia Plath. These were edited by Francis McCullough and with Ted Hughes as consulting editor. That year, her remaining diaries were acquired by her alma mater, Smith College, but Hughes required two of them to be sealed until 2030, the 50th anniversary of Plath's death. Then, when we talk about literary themes and styles of Plath, we see that Plath wrote largely in the style of confessional poetry, a highly personal genre that, as its name suggests, reveals intense internal emotions. As a genre, it often focuses on extreme experiences of emotion and taboo subjects, such as sexuality, mental illness, trauma, and death or suicide. Plath, along with her friends and mentors Lowell and Sexton, is considered one of the primary exemplars of this genre. Much of Plath's writing deals with fairly dark themes, particularly surrounding mental illness and suicide. Although Her early poetry uses more natural imagery. It is still shot through with moments of violence and medical images. Her milder landscape poetry, however, remains as a less known section of her work. Her more famous works, such as the Belzer and Ariel, are fully immersed in intense themes of death, rage, despair, love, and redemption. Her own experiences with depression and suicide attempts, as well as the treatments for it that endured, color much of her writing, although it is not solely autobiographical. The feminine voice of Plath's writing was one of her key legacies as well. There was unmistakable female rage, passion, frustration, and grief in Plath's poetry, which was almost unheard of at that point. Some of her work, such as the Belzer, explicitly addresses the situation of ambitious women in the 1950s and the ways society frustrated and repressed them. So, talking about Plath's death, Plath continued to struggle with depression and suicidal thoughts throughout her life. In the final months of her life, she was in the throes of the long lasting depressive episode, which also caused serious insomnia. And over the months, she lost nearly 20 pounds and described severe depression symptoms to her doctor. The doctor prescribed her an antidepressant in February 1963 and arranged for a live-in nurse. Since he was unable to have her admitted to the hospital for more immediate treatment. On morning of February 11, 1963, the nurse arrived at the apartment and could not get inside. When she finally had a workman help her enter, they found Plath dead. She was 30 years old then. Although they had been separated for several months, Hughes was distraught at the news of her death and chose the quote for her gravestone: "Even amidst fierce flames, the golden lotus can be planted." So Plath was buried in the graveyard at St. Thomas the Apostle in Heptonstall in England. After her death, a practice developed where Plath's fans defaced her gravestone by chiseling off Hughes on her gravestone, largely in response to criticism over Hughes' handling of her estate and papers. Hughes himself published a volume in 1998 that revealed more about his relationship with Plath. At the time, he was suffering from terminal cancer and died soon after. In 2009, her son, Nicholas Hughes, who, like his mother, suffered from depression, also died by suicide. Talking about the legacy that Plath left behind, we can say that Plath remains one of the better known names in American literature. And she, along with some of her contemporaries, helped to reshape and redefine the poetry world. The visceral image and emotions of the pages of her work shattered through some of the cautions and taboos of the time, shedding light on issues of gender and mental illness that were rarely discussed up until that point, or at least not with such brutal honesty. People used to hide these feelings of illness, mental illness, and gender inequality. So, in popular culture, we can say that Plath's legacy is occasionally reduced to her personal struggles with mental illness, her more morbid poetry, and her ultimate death by suicide. Plath was, of course, much more than that, and those who knew her personally did not describe her as being permanently dark and miserable. Plath's creative legacy lived on not just in her own works but in her children as well, Both her children had creative careers, and her daughter, Frida Hughes, is currently an artist and an author of poetry and children's book. So, this is about Sylvia Plath's biography. That is all in today's lecture. Thank you all.